Hello, in this video, we'll be looking at Indigenous Studies. To start this off, let's look at the history of the treatment of Indigenous people and communities. Christopher Columbus, a famous European explorer, was on the hunt for India and its riches. Instead, on his voyage across the globe, he stumbled upon North America in 1492. Still believing that he is in India, Christopher Columbus referred to the indigenous people on the land as Indians. The Europeans saw the potential North America had. They established trading posts with the indigenous population, and it became a location for French and British settlement. The land was slowly being colonized by the Europeans. Because of the process of colonization, indigenous communities were forced to give up their land, and those who refused met fatal consequences. Europeans banned traditional ceremonies and started a movement to assimilate the indigenous population. They wanted to remove their culture and move them into modern society. In 1831, the first residential school was established, Mohawk Indian Residential School in Brantford, Ontario. Now that we have the background information, let's continue looking at the treatment of Indigenous people throughout history. To begin with, Europeans basically took over North America, including Canada. The land that was once owned by the Indigenous people was taken over by the Europeans. It would feel awful if one day, out of seemingly nowhere, someone took something of yours that meant a lot to you. They were forced to get off their former land and removed to live on reserves constructed by the government. When the residential school era began, children of all ages were torn apart from their families and were forced to attend the schools. At first, families encouraged their children to go so that they could learn and have a brighter future, but little did they know they tried to eradicate their culture, with much violence and mistreatment. Very few Indigenous children survived and made it to the end of the residential school. Many died. The death rate in this residential school was a shocking 40 to 60%, but close to 100% of the Indigenous students faced severe physical and emotional abuse. The Europeans didn't acknowledge the Indigenous community or their culture, and that became very clear very fast. 1996 was a year of relief. The last residential school closed. You may think to yourself, finally, the mistreatment of Indigenous communities is over. You would be very, very incorrect. After the closure of residential schools, a large majority of the surviving Indigenous children and their families continue to live on reserves, separated from modern society. They lived on these reserves because their land, their traditional livelihoods, and their culture had been ripped away from them. They had been placed on impoverished land by the government. At present time, close to 46% of the Indigenous population in Canada live on reserves. These reserves are not getting necessary attention from the government. Living conditions in these reserves do not come close to meeting Canadian standards. There is a high rate of alcohol consumption and suicides. Houses are dilapidated, usually overcrowded. No one ever thinks about upgrading their house because of low income. Most of the water in these reserves is contaminated. It's almost as if the Indigenous people who live on these reserves are living in third world conditions. On the bright side, throughout history, Canada has gained more and more respect for the Indigenous population. And although the conditions they face today aren't ideal, to a great extent, they're better than conditions they faced in the past. Governments and churches have apologized several times for the mistreatment of Indigenous children in residential schools, but is one sorry sufficient for a life's worth of trauma? That most certainly was passed down to generations in the form of intergenerational trauma. The TRC, short for the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada, was created because of the Indian Residential Schools Settlement Agreement. The purpose of it was to compensate survivors of residential schools and to work towards an equitable future for Indigenous communities. The TRC was established in 2008 with the purpose of documenting the history and impacts the residential school system had on Indigenous families. It gave survivors the opportunity to share their experiences and bring light to the events. In 2015, the TRC released a summary of its findings with 94 calls to action, urging all levels of government to work together and change policies, with the hope to repair harm caused by the residential schools. The report concluded that the residential school system was a cultural genocide. The TRC gave residential school survivors and Indigenous communities to let their voice be heard. They got to express their pain that they had held in for years, complaints that they had about their treatment in present time, and it was an excellent opportunity to raise awareness for Indigenous treatment. As one of the 94 calls to action, there was a national inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women. The Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women is a movement that advocates for the termination of violence against Native women. Around the time of 1980 and 2012, about 1,180 Indigenous women were reported missing or murdered. Indigenous people usually live on reserves with horrible living conditions. They are treated differently because of their background with Canada. This movement continues to empower Indigenous women and supporters of this movement who are standing up to this sort of violence, with the hope to end all sort of mistreatment of Indigenous people. Out of 94, to date, 14 calls of action have been completed and 23 are in progress. It makes Canadians and Indigenous people very happy to see this huge movement, which will inform Canadians about the crimes against the Indigenous, and hopefully they will receive compensation and exposure to these issues. The Indian Act is the main law used to administer Indian status. It has gone through many amendments. The Indian Act defined an Indian as any male person of Indian blood reputed to belong to a particular band. You would lose your status if they graduated university, married a non-status person, or became a doctor or lawyer. Later, changes in the Indian Act allowed women to also be eligible for Indian status. This act in many ways restricted Indigenous people to advance further in society whilst keeping their Indian status. Many had their Indian status ripped from them. Could you imagine someone taking your identity? The Indian Act also made it illegal to practice Indian culture and celebrate Indian traditions, further forcing them to assimilate into Euro-Canadian culture. What the government was trying to achieve by forcing Indians to be distant from their culture was they wanted to terminate their culture. For example, if the young adults at the time were forced to forget their culture, their children and so on would not be taught their culture until it ceases to exist. Although they did not achieve this goal, they still achieved it to a certain extent. Many Indigenous people today have forgotten their language, their traditions, or never learned it in the first place. Many are questioning their own identity and have accepted to live the Canadian way. It will take time for their culture to be relearned and passed down once again, maybe even generations. The Oka confrontation, also known as the Oka crisis, began in July 1990. This land belonged to the Mohawk tribe and had sought recognition of their rights to the land since the 1700s. Federal government classified the land as an interim land base and it was not a reserve, and therefore was not covered under the Indian Act. In 1961, a 9-hole golf course was built on land close to the traditional Mohawk burial ground. The Mohawk filed a claim to stop the construction of the golf course, but that was rejected and it was built anyway. Mayor of Oka, Jean Ouellette, announced that she planned to have a townhouse complex built and that the golf course will be expanded over the ancestral cemetery. Months of protests by the Mohawks did nothing to shift plans. and construction was scheduled to begin early 1990. Some people made their efforts to stop the expansion of the golf course and a townhouse complex. They made barricades to block access to the area. Many people from nearby reserves joined the protest. Quebec's provincial police forced advance to the barricade and used tear gas and concussion grenades. In July, RCMP and the Canadian Armed Forces were brought to help. Numbers in Mohawk and people diminished as many fled. The resistance ended when Prime Minister Mulroney promised to meet some of the Mohawks' demands. The federal government agreed to prevent further development and the golf course expansion, as well as the townhouse construction. They were both officially cancelled. This continues to be a reminder of how much Indigenous people have struggled for their land rights. This incident did not happen very long ago and displays the amount of respect for Indigenous people in their land. Not very much. The province did everything in their power to get that golf course expansion built, even going as far as to getting help from the armed forces. Indigenous communities, especially the Mohawk tribe, now are more aware of their traditional and ancestral land and will do anything to protect that land. The Idle No More movement is a grassroots movement for Indigenous rights and the attempt to revitalize Indigenous culture. The Idle No More movement started in 2012 as an opposition to Bill C-45, formerly known as the Jobs and Growth Act, but slowly grew to cover all of the issues and tensions faced by the Indigenous community. These problems include poor education, poor living standards, poor healthcare, and much more. Teresa Spence, chief of the Attawapiskat First Nation, went on a 6-week hunger strike in front of Parliament Hill. Bill C-45 was a bill introduced by Stephen Harper to implement provisions of the budget tabled in Parliament. This doesn't really sound like it could spark a movement against the Indigenous community, right? The Act changes some legislations. The changes that sparked the movement are found in the Indian Act, Navigation Protection Act, and Environmental Assessment Act. As an example, in the Navigation Protection Act, considerable pipeline and power line project supporters are not required to prove if their project will damage a waterway that it crosses. Idle No More believes this endangers almost every lake and river in Canada, especially those in Indigenous and Native land. In 2021, over 1,300 unmarked graves of Indigenous children at residential schools were discovered. 80 municipalities and territories cancelled Big Canada Day events and festivals because of this horrifying discovery. We can see that Canada and governments are becoming increasingly supportive towards Indigenous people. We can see that they're being respected, their culture is being respected, and so is their land. In previous years, the government changed laws not in favor of Indigenous people, such as the Indian Act and the Residential Schools Treaty, which had the purpose of removing Indigenous culture and assimilating Indigenous people into Euro-Canadian culture. The government was also not supportive during the Oka crisis, when they refused to recognize the Indigenous ownership of their land. Although throughout history, governments have made terrible decisions that discriminate and cause mistreatment to Indigenous people, there is some hope. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission report is a great example of how the Government of Canada is changing tides and becoming more supportive of Indigenous communities. In the TCR report, the Trudeau government recognized 94 calls to action, ways to bring light to the inequitable experiences faced by Indigenous people throughout history, and to give compensation. This report, issued by the government, like I said before, helps revitalize Indigenous culture and to educate the country about themselves, their identity, and their experiences. Land acknowledgement is an excellent way to show respect and homage to the Indigenous people whose land we live and walk on. It is important to understand that the land we stand on today, it was never originally ours and always belonged to the indigenous population. Canadians should be committed to this practice because as a Canadian, it is important to know your history and to acknowledge the history behind the land. It's the least we can do to respect First Nations, whose land we took. Social trends. When Europeans came to Canada, to them, Indigenous people were thought to be exotic, pre-civilized life, and were actually respected until the Europeans found out the treasures they had, the materials they had. As time passed, the respect for Indigenous people diminished. Europeans didn't despise the Indians, but they used them as pawns to gain resources and land. Because of this impact, Indigenous people lost their land, and it made them furious how they showed up one day and took their land and resources. During the 1800s, Europeans were tired of Indigenous people and how different they were from the rest of society. Government tried their best to assimilate them. Here is where a political trend comes in. The introduction of the Indian Act and the Residential Schools Treaty, which are both used to convert and assimilate Indigenous people into society by suppressing their culture. This deeply impacted Indigenous people as many died from residential schools, almost all were brutally abused, and all were forced to forget their traditions and culture, causing intergenerational trauma that is still faced to this day. Economical. With the introduction of the Indian Act, Indian men could not graduate university, marry a non-status person, or become a doctor or lawyer without losing their status. Most Indigenous people did not try to do any of this because they did not want to lose their status. Without this proper education, Indigenous people were impoverished, especially since they lost their valuable land and were made to reside in poor reserves. Even nowadays, the yearly salary of an average Indigenous person living in a reserve is just a mere $14,000 per year. In the 1900s, when looking at the world wars, Indigenous people were allowed to enlist for war, unlike Black Canadians, but were not actively recruited. As casualties grew for the Canadian Expeditionary Force and soldier numbers diminished, Indigenous people were officially encouraged to enlist for war. The late 1900s was when Indigenous people and their mistreatment was brought to attention, even seeing how most residential schools officially shut down around the 1970s, with the last closing down in 1996, as we discussed. Public was starting to recognize the Indigenous for who they are and stood up with them. A great example of this is the Missing and Murdered movement, in which many non-Indigenous people took part in protests, and the I Don't Know More movement. Governments also began to support Indigenous communities more. Let's look at the current conditions of Indigenous people in Canada. Many Indigenous people suffer from intergenerational trauma, passed down from their parents or grandparents, caused from terrifying experiences at residential schools. The prevalence of alcohol abuse and drug usage in Indigenous youth was around 17 to 22%, respectively, while non-Indigenous youth had prevalence rates of 5 and 3%, respectively. You can see a major difference between these two. Reserves in Canada have very poor conditions. There's inadequate funding for schools in reserves, which raised many concerns when looking at education. More than half, almost 70% of First Nation adults living on reserve consume alcohol, drinking heavily. High unemployment rates, water contamination, lack of housing, high rates of violence, depression, and much more. And much higher suicide rates are just some of many problems in reserves. According to Statistics Canada, suicide rates among First Nations is 3 times that of someone who isn't First Nation. A shocking 24.3 deaths per 100,000 people per year are at risk. The poverty in reserves causes insufficient housing, poor education, and even poor health care, which can lead to life-threatening problems that are normally preventable. The conditions of Indigenous people today are not ideal. It's hard to live on these reserves, and it's hard to live knowing the mistreatment their kind and culture have faced in the past. I believe that we should all do our part in advocating for Indigenous people and better treatment. We can do this by starting our own movements. These small movements can create a snowball effect, and believe it or not, the efforts will get recognized eventually, especially seeing how Canada and the Canadian government have increased support for Indigenous people. Social media is an excellent way to spread awareness to a topic. Social media can be used to promote better conditions in reserves. By posting something, for example, writing a blog on the bad conditions of reserves or making an infographic explaining it, and then getting more people to do the same thing, it's like a pyramid scheme, but for a genuine and good cause. If it ever comes to it, an extreme option for advocating for Indigenous people is a protest, which has been done many, many times and is still being done. Protests can be done in the form of a hunger strike or a rally. Protests are usually the most effective way because it's a way to effectively communicate your demands clearly and loudly.